In England, when a monarch ascends to the throne, the king or the queen, as the case may be, is invested with authority and with status and dominion. But also, the king or the queen is given a list of titles like Your Majesty. One of the titles that's always intrigued me is the title Defensor Fidei, the defender of the faith. That's because in England has a state church, and traditionally it is the responsibility of the monarch to use the power of the army or the sword or whatever it takes to defend the church. But in church history, God has given us great men who have defended the faith not by the sword or with military might, but with their lips and with their pens. We have the portraits of some of the greatest defenders of the faith in all of church history. John Calvin, of course, from the 16th century, St. Augustine from the early centuries of the church, Jonathan Edwards from here in America from the 18th century, St. Thomas Aquinas, Benjamin Breckinridge Warfield from Princeton, and of course, Francis Schaeffer, our 20th century defender of the faith. In the series of mock debates that you are about to see, I am convinced that you are going to have the opportunity of hearing from the one who, in my judgment, is the greatest living Christian apologist, the defender of the faith par excellence, Dr. John Gerstner.
This debate is entitled, Can We Know Truth?
We're about to begin a series of unrehearsed debates between myself and my colleague, Dr. John Gerstner. Now, it's important to note at the outset that these debates are, properly speaking, mock debates. That means that, in one sense, they're insincere, inasmuch as the positions I will be espousing will be positions that I myself do not believe or adhere to. My ignominious role in this exercise is to serve as the devil's advocate. I'd like to say that that role was chosen by lot, but instead we tried out for the parts and I lost. But in our first session together, Dr. Gerstner, we're going to be discussing the question of truth and ethics. And let me begin by calling attention to what is clear, I'm sure, to you and everyone else, that we live in an age that has been marked by extraordinary discoveries in science that in turn have influenced philosophy and theology and all of the other disciplines. And one that has certainly made an impact on my thinking is the concept of relativity, as it has changed the whole structure of the modern world. But not only is relativity something that we conceive of with respect to science, but I think now safely with respect to all truth. I notice that you Christians tend to make bold declarations and affirmations about truth, and yet from my perspective as a modern person, I have to say, Dr. Gerstner, that as far as I can see, truth is relative. So how would you respond to that?
Well, there's one level at which I would agree with it thoroughly. Truth is relative to the understanding mind, for example. There's a truth out there which is addressed to you and to me and to the audience out there, and it's understood by you and me and the audience out there, and it's understood relative to each one of us. I don't think there's anything objectionable to that notion, but I think I know what's up your sleeve, Mr. Devil's Advocate, and how you are going to make something rather sinister out of it. But since you put the question to me at the outset, what is my Christian reaction to relativity? It's very affirmative as far as that's concerned. God and the world and everything else is relative to the knowing mind. I see no problems with that from a Christian standpoint.
What I'm saying, though, Dr. Gerstner, is not simply that I have to relate to God and to the world and to propositions that people make here and there. In that sense, we're all relatives, one of another. I'm not disputing that. Okay. But what I'm saying is that the truth itself is conditioned by my perception of it. And that what may be true, for example, for you, in your religious devotion, you may believe that there is a God, an eternal God who's the object of your devotion and of your prayers and your preaching and that sort of thing. So that for you, Dr. Gerstner, it's true to say there is a God because you relate to that. It has meaning for you and significance to you. But for me, Dr. Gerstner, that doesn't mean anything. There's no God. So for me, it's true to say God does not exist. That's what I mean when I say the truth is relative.
You're quite correct when you say that we Christians say there is a God. Now, first of all, that's a proposition which I maintain is a true proposition. Now, you are hostile to it, but I take it you're not hostile to a definition of the term. You understand the same as I understand what that proposition means. Would you agree with me on that?
Yes, I think we could have a basic agreement of as the meaning of the statement in the sense of as a sentence and as a proposition, we both understand what these words in connection communicate. Yes, I understand that. But what I'm saying, Dr. Gerstner, is that you affirm the truth of this statement.
That's exactly so.
And because it's meaningful to you, it is true for you.
It's meaningful to you, but you affirm the falsehood of it.
Well, I don't believe there is a God.
You don't believe there's a God, but that's a meaningful proposition to which you give that negative response.
That's correct.
It's a meaningful proposition to which I give an affirmative response. And the rational thing for rational people to do at a point like this is to ask, what's the reason I affirm it, or what's the reason you deny it? Well, do you want to take the initiative, or do you want me to?
I say the reason I deny it is that I don't get any particular personal significance out of it. It's irrelevant to my life. If there is this God that you put so much stock in and believe in, I don't know anything about him, and he doesn't make any difference to me.
You're saying it's irrelevant. Now, that is an irrelevant, that is a non-rational proposition, I would say, because if this being does exist, and I'm assuming a dictionary definition of the term, just as you, he is the author of your being. And for you to stand there and say, that is irrelevant to me, doesn't sound like a very brilliant observation.
Well, what I'm saying is that there is a God, that may be true for you, because I'm saying that truth is defined by personal meaning. And because you find meaning in this to your own life, subjective significance, then I would agree, Dr. Gerstner, that this is a true statement. There is a God. That's true. But what I'm saying is it's true for you. It's not true for me, because I don't believe it.
Now, you're shifting to another subject, but before you do, if we're going to make any progress in this discussion and debate, we've got to go step at a time. You are withdrawing the statement that it is irrelevant. This is highly relevant to you unless you can prove that this being does not exist. Now, you have insinuated that it can't be proven because truth is proven by feeling. And you don't have any positive feeling about that.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay. Now, since when is truth determined just by positive being? Would you deny that this being about whom you have a negative feeling, therefore does not exist because this devil's advocate does not have a positive feeling about him?
That's correct.
You'd consider that a rational remark?
Well, I'm not interested whether it's rational, and this is a matter of what I'm saying.
I thought we were talking about truth.
We are talking about truth, but we're trying to get a definition, and I'm saying to you, you want to have a rational, objective concept of truth. I'm telling you, we don't live in the dark ages anymore. The age of rationalism is over, Dr. Gerstner. Welcome to the 20th century. I have an existential view of truth. And for me, as an existentialist, truth is an experience. It's an encounter. It's feeling more than rational propositions. And you want to insist the truth is some kind of objective, rational system.
You want to say that any truth, this or any other truth, stirs up a certain feeling in an individual if it's going to be significant. I gather you're not denying the objectivity of the concept, but what you're still going back to is that it's not relevant to me unless I am internally involved in it positively.
That's
it's
right.
not just internally involved in it. You can be internally involved in it in a hostile fashion.
Yes, I would grant that. It would be relevant in a negative sense.
All right,
relevant,
so
yes.
R.C. Sproul is actually affected by. Truth affects this devil's advocate and so on, and therefore it is evaluated, but presumably before it can even affect you, it has to be a proposition you understand and respond to negatively, does it not?
That's correct.
Okay, so this particular truth is not subjectivized just because it stimulates a certain kind of subjective response in you, negative, in me, positive. But you are not shifting away from truth by simply saying the thing that's really relevant or significant or interesting to R.C. Sproul is that it affects me negatively and therefore I dismiss it. But I'm challenging your proposition that this is not an objective entity simply because the important thing about it, in your opinion, is how this entity affects you. And as a matter of fact, it affects you negatively.
That's correct.
Okay, so it's not even the affected that's concerned. It's the negativity of the effect, but it's still an objective to which you negatively respond.
All right, but again, you're assuming that there really is such a being to which I'm not just merely responding to a proposition. I grant the objectivity of the proposition.
Yep.
Every proposition is objective.
Right.
But the proposition is describing something beyond itself. We're not arguing about this sentence. We're arguing about the content of this sentence, which is the existence of God.
That's really the next step.
All right.
But the point is that you have given up this notion that subjectivity or relativity or existential relativity is what's important about that. And I'm denying that. And then you take a really sound, rational statement when you infer that whether this affects a person negatively or positively would depend entirely on whether or not this being can be not only stated as a proposition, but proved to exist as a rational being.
You mean proved to exist apart from me and apart from you?
Oh, if it be a being like this, of course he would exist independently.
All right, I would have to grant, Dr. Gerstner, maybe to my boss's chagrin.
Yes, he wouldn't be too happy with this.
That if there is a God out there, apart from my feelings, apart from my relationships and all of that, and apart from your relationship and all of that, I would have to grant that would be relevant.
Okay, then let me try to show you that this God must be.
Before you do that, let me say to you what I'm struggling with here. That I guess the reason why I'm saying that this proposition becomes a matter of personal, subjective preference, if you will, is because I don't really think we can know in the final analysis if there is such a being independent of your personal feelings about it and my personal feelings. What I mean, Dr. Gerstner, is I don't think we can know whether there is such a being, but it doesn't matter, because if you respond positively, for you it's true, And if I don't respond positively, then for me it's not a viable truth in my life. But what I'm saying is, I'm not agnostic about that we can make sentences that are objective, and I'm not even agnostic about what you said here, that if there is a God, it would be relevant. But I'm not agnostic about whether we can know such a truth.
Well, when we all agree on the fact that if there be such a being as that, it's highly relevant how you feel about him. And if he does exist and you feel negatively about him, you're in a bad way. And if I feel positively about him, I'm in a good way. That's all accepted. The whole point now rests in this one thing, whether we can know this being. Now, you're maintaining that we can't even know before we even deal with the question, because the only kind of knowing that you're interested in and want to maintain is the only kind of knowing possible, is one that affects you positively. That's your subtle underlying implication.
No, I've qualified that. I've said that only comes into play in areas where we're dealing with subjects or questions that I'm convinced we can't know about objectively.
Well, what do rational people do when one person says we can't know and the other person says we can know? Where do you go from there?
Well, you have to debate it. That's why we're here.
Now, do you want to prove he can't exist, or do you want me to prove he can exist?
No. I'm not going to say that. I didn't say that he doesn't exist. I said we can't know. I'm not being,
You know he exists. You admit that.
What?
You just said, I don't care. We know
I said we cannot know that he exists.
You're going to say that. How are you going to prove that you can't know God exists?
Because he's beyond the pale
you
of
already
my
know
knowledge.
a great deal about him, don't you?
Wait a minute. For example, certainly as a theologian, as a philosopher, you're well aware of the monumental critique of the traditional arguments for the existence of God that was proffered by Immanuel Kant.
Yes,
and
I'm familiar with that.
You know that Kant has shown that of such a being as you describe as God is in a realm that is beyond our ability to get at. I mean, we can't see him, we can't touch him, we can't taste him. We have no access to a metaphysical realm beyond the physical things that we can investigate through science. So God cannot be an object of scientific inquiry.
We can't know God.
And we can't know him rationally. What other way is there?
We can't know God because Kant said we can't know God.
Well, Dr. Gerstner, you know that's not the argument.
Well, that's
not
said?
An argument. I just reminded you that Kant has made that conclusion.
Yes, he has.
I think that he's done it validly. I was using shorthand, aware of the fact that you would know the arguments that Kant has
I also
given.
know it as non-cogent. If you're going to show me it's cogent, I'll be very interested.
Well, tell me, first of all, how can you know anything about a being who is beyond the scope of sense perception?
This being could, for example, you're just asking me how it would be possible.
Yes.
I can answer you on a hypothetical matter, which I think is true. This being, who is beyond visibility and beyond total comprehensibility, could make things by means of which he would reveal the nature of his being. I'm a finite person, and he could actually create things that are finite also, which could cue me into the fact that he's the author of those things. That would be telling me something about him, that he's already there at the beginning, and that he makes these things, and he's intelligent in the way he goes about it, and he's benign in his tendency, and he's moral too, because he's affect me morally as well.
What I hear coming out of your mouth is, forgive me if I'm being presumptuous, but is nothing more than the old cosmological argument for the existence of God that I thought that Kant demolished here. Is it not? Aren't you pleading cosmologically? You're saying God makes a universe, he makes a cosmos, and even though he never shows up in it personally, we can't see him, he's invisible to our eyes, we don't hear his words spoken audibly, but we see the universe, and you're saying somehow that universe reveals something to me about God.
You're giving a very fine statement of a cosmological argument. Now, why don't you make a critique of it while you're at it?
All right, isn't that what you're arguing for?
I'm using it. You're not showing any fallacy in it.
How can we get through this massive leap from looking at this podium or the blackboard to...
You use all these pejorative terms.
Well, we are moving to a very high degree.
Moving and leaping are two different things, my friend.
But I think of leaping of something we do when we want to get up in the air.
Yeah,
and we want to get up in the air here. We want to get off the terrestrial plane.
I'm just simply saying I'm not going to bow before your use of pejorative language. I'm going to insist that you put some cogency in.
All right, what I want to know is how, Dr. Gerstner, you can reason from this created realm to this invisible creator.
Okay, I've already told you, and you've been mocked it out, but I'll say it again, and I'll ask you, if you don't have to take this mock debate so seriously as that to give mock arguments, you know, on, that you will actually address what I say rather than make authoritative statements. Immanuel Kant thought differently.
Simply trying to identify the argument as the cosmological argument. Now, I would say, with Kant,
yes,
my ally,
okay,
that what it requires to move, whether it's a gentle step,
okay,
a progression up a ladder,
rationally move,
you know, or
we're talking sense now
here, whatever it is, Dr. Gerstner.
Yeah.
We are moving. You grant that.
We're not leaping.
From this sphere, okay, but we are moving from this sphere to some metaphysical sphere. Now, it would seem to me, Dr. Gerstner, that in order to do that, we would have to make some assumptions, which I think with Kant,
such as,
all right, I will
seem to get an argument out of you.
I'm trying to give it to you. That the assumption that we're making, that I would regard as gratuitous, as a leap.
Go ahead. Now I know what Immanuel Kant and R.C. Sproul, the devil's advocate,
is
one little argument.
That the assumption here, Dr. Gerstner, is that the law of causality, which we use in our scientific inquiry of this world,
that's true,
would apply to this other world equally.
That is not necessarily true.
Aren't you resting your case on some kind of causal deduction?
Oh, I am, but that doesn't mean that in this other world it would be exactly the same.
Well, how do
For me to argue from this world to the fact that it requires this God in this other world you're talking about is one thing. To say that God's self-knowledge would be of the same nature as something else again. But we don't have to get that. All we need, as far as our debate is concerned, is for you to show me this is a gratuitous leap and that these cosmological arguments that you denigrate so liberally and so on are actually non-cogent. You just don't like the idea of moving from this world to the other world.
You're assuming that because there's a world here, there has to be
I'm not assuming anything. You're the guy who's putting that word assumption.
Correct me. I'm thinking, what I'm hearing you say is that because there's a world here that we can perceive, that is visible to us.
What's that? That is an assumption.
Because that world is here, all right? No, that's not the assumption. I'm saying that what I'm assuming, or what I think you're assuming or arguing for, is that because we can perceive this world here, this world somehow bears witness to an antecedent cause.
That's true.
That is God.
That would have to be God.
And the reasoning that we use to get there is causal. Is that correct?
Okay.
All right, so that now you have this antecedent cause for this visible universe.
Okay.
Why does there have to be an antecedent cause?
Why does it have to be what?
Why does there have to be some kind of antecedent cause behind the universe? Why can't the universe be its own cause?
All right, let's hypothecate that. Let's say for a moment here, you're going to prove now, you're taking on the business of proving that we can't know God, and you're going to say, why can't we assume that this world is eternal, huh?
No.
No? Correct me. What are you wanting?
It's its own cause.
Its own cause. So, presumably, indefinitely. If it's its own cause, it's been there, presumably now. If it's there now and its own cause, Presumably it would have existed this way, or at least in some shape forever.
Or we could go through an infinite series of finite causes and so on, but
if you're the one who's saying finite causes, you won't even let me finish my sentence, but all right, finite causes. That's your language now, right?
Yes.
You got a series of finite clauses. Well, manifestly, if they're finite, they can't be unlimited, can they? No. And they could not, of course, have existed of themselves finitely or temporally.
Not any single one of them.
Or all of them.
But the series.
But they're all finite, aren't they not? Isn't that what you've been saying?
No, I say each of the causes is a finite cause, but the series is infinite.
Each of these finite items, each finite item depends on its own. I just want to make sure I get what you're saying. It takes the shape of an argument and not a mere accusation and so on. Each finite item has own cause.
That's correct.
Infinitely.
Yes.
Eternally.
Yes.
All right, now suppose for this, I don't believe that's the case. But I'm like my friend Thomas Aquinas over there. He maintained you couldn't prove you wrong at this particular point. I think we could, but I'll go along with the master Thomistic reasoner at this point and grant you that what I consider diabolical thought, that the universe could actually be eternal. Okay? But nevertheless, you have ventured into the open now, as you devils don't like to do.
Well, actually, this has just been an exercise to warm us up to go further on this discussion of the existence of God. What I was trying to get from you here is the groundwork, the method that you use to try to prove such a thing as the existence of God. And I see that what you're doing is you're using your senses for the world and then your reason to go back to this first cause.
Yeah.
All right, I understand that.
I know you don't like it, but
I don't like it, but I get the point. But there's still some things I need to iron out with you on this, and we'll take them up in the next session, if you don't mind. I appreciate your patience with this poor fallen devil. But we'll go on and really look at this more sharply in our next engagement. Yes. So we continue now with our overview of the subject, What is Reformed Theology? I've recently published a book entitled Grace Unknown, and the subheading or the subtitle for this book is The Heart of Reformed Theology. And I'm basically trying to follow the outline of this book, which goes into much greater detail of these things than I'm able to do in this brief summary. But in our first session, we saw that Reformed theology is a theology. And now I want to suggest to you that Reformed theology is a systematic theology. It's been one of my privileges of my lifetime to be able to teach the discipline of systematic theology at the seminary level. And I know in this day and age, with the advent of existential philosophy, for example, there's been this growing antipathy, or an allergy, as it were, against the whole idea of systems. And sometimes there's good reason for that. Part of the concern that people have is that we know what happens when people take a system of philosophy and then take that system and bring it over to the pages of the Bible and then try to force everything that the Bible says into that system. Now, the idea of systematic thinking goes way back in church history, but even in the period of the Enlightenment, with the advent of the modern scientific method, the philosophers of those days discovered or advocated a method for science that they called the analytical method of study, which in abbreviated terms and in popular language was called the task of seeking to find the logic of the facts. That is, the scientists would explore the details of the physical universe and point their telescopes into the heavens and gather as much particular data as they possibly could. And after they got this data, they tried to make sense out of it.
They try to see how all the particular parts fit together. Now, historically, the task of systematic theology is something like that. It is not to come to the Bible with a preconceived system, but rather to come to the Bible, listen to the Word of God in all of its particulars, in all of its details, and then try to discern how all of these individual truths fit together. Because the assumption of systematic theology is this, that the Bible is coherent. That though God reveals many things to us, that all of His truth is unified in His own person and in His own character. And I find this actually in teaching. Sometimes we'll have seminars where it'll be kind of an open-ended discussion with my students. And we'll start the seminar by looking at a particular doctrine in the panoply of systematic theology. And if I allow the students to interact with their questions, in a very short period of time, we run far afield from the doctrine we first started to study. And at first glance, it may seem that we're just running around chasing rabbits down extraneous rabbit trails, but then I remind them, I said, these questions that you're asking are questions that we should be asking because they flow out of the doctrine that we're studying. Because every doctrine of Christian theology touches in some way every other doctrine of the faith. That is, the whole of the Christian faith is intimately and intricately related in all of its pieces. In fact, one of the things that never ceases to amaze me is the way the Bible speaks about so many things over so many years and myriads of details, and yet the symmetry of Scripture is there. It fits together in such a coherent way. Well, when we say that Reformed theology is systematic, that's what we're saying at the outset, that we are trying not to impose a system upon the Scripture, but to find the system of doctrine that is in the Scriptures themselves, to see how all of the parts fit together. Now, one of the ironies of Reformed theology, I'll even use the word paradox, even though I sometimes choke on that word, I'll say to my students when we study systematic theology, we usually begin systematic theology with the study of what's called theology proper. Now, that isn't distinguished from improper theology, but theology proper refers to a focus on the doctrine of God, as distinguished from the doctrine of sin or the doctrine of justification or some other doctrine, but rather our understanding of the nature and character of God Himself. And here's where the paradox comes in. At the beginning of that study, I will say to my students that if we look at Reformed creeds and confessions and read what they say about the nature of God, you'll have to look very, very hard to find anything in there that would be distinctively Reformed. I mean, the confessions of Methodists and Lutherans and Episcopalians and all other denominations have basically the same content and the same affirmations in their creeds. We all say that God is eternal. We all believe that God is invisible, that He is a spirit, that He's immutable, omnipotent, omniscient, and all those other things that we speak of with respect to the attributes of God. So I say, on the one hand, there's nothing particularly distinctive about the doctrine of God in Reformed theology that makes Reformed theology different from other theologies. And yet, again, here's the paradox. If someone were to say to me, R.C., what do you think is the most distinctive aspect of Reformed theology? I won't hesitate to answer that question by saying, oh, it's our doctrine of God. You say, wait a minute. giving me an Excedrin headache. You just said a minute ago, I heard you say it, that there's nothing particularly distinctive about the doctrine of God and Reformed theology. And now you're saying, out of the other side of your mouth, paradoxically, that the most distinctive thing about Reformed theology is its doctrine of God. What are you trying to say? And I can see the puzzled looks on people who are sitting in front of me this very minute when I make this seemingly contradictory statement. I accent the word seemingly. Let me try to unwrap it for you and tell you what I mean by it. All Christians have a basically orthodox creedal affirmation about the character of God. But what I think happens frequently in other theologies is that when the attention is diverted to another doctrine, there is a tendency to forget your affirmation about the character of God. And the doctrine of God is just one of many doctrines in the faith, rather than the controlling doctrine of the faith. For example, I've never met a Christian in my life who looked me in the eye and said, I don't believe that God is sovereign. Christians, characteristically, are quite willing to affirm the sovereignty of God. But if we push the discussion to the relationship of God's sovereignty, for example, to the doctrine of election, to the doctrines of grace, in a very short period of time, there will be a very serious controversy about the nature of God. Does God ordain everything that comes to pass? Does He know everything that comes to pass before it happens? Again, if we just backed up and said, do you believe that God is omniscient? Most Christians will say yes. But then when we explore what it means that God knows everything, are we saying the same thing? Are we saying that He knows it simply because He has some genius perception? Or do we say that He knows all things because He ordains all things? That is, what is the relationship of His sovereignty to His knowledge? In Reformed theology, we constantly test our doctrine by going back to our fundamental understanding of the character of God. And I really think that's the central, unique factor of Reformed theology. It is that it is relentlessly committed to maintain the purity of the doctrine of God through every other element of our theology. Now, there's some other things I want to say about Reformed theology, and that is that Reformed theology is not only systematic, but Reformed theology is Catholic. Now, what do I mean by that when I say that Reformed theology is Catholic? Usually we think of the Reformation as being a protest against Catholicism. But remember that the theology that emerged and came to the front of the stage in the 16th century was not something that was invented for the first time in the 16th century. It was a reformation, not a revolution. It was an attempt in the 16th century to recover the historic Christian apostolic faith. And at the time of the Reformation, virtually every church that arose out of it continued to embrace the Catholic truths of the Christian faith. That is, the truths that are embraced and confessed by Christians of all stripes, of all denominations, and of all traditions. That is, here the word Catholic does not refer to the Roman Catholic Church or to the Russian Catholic Church or some particular group, but rather the term is used in its original sense, meaning universal, the whole church. For example, in the early centuries, the church had in assembly crucial councils to deal with major theological issues, with the threat of major heresies, such as the Arian controversy in the 4th century, the Monophysite controversy in the 5th century, and so on, where at these great councils, such as the Council of Nicaea, the deity of Christ was firmly embraced and confessed. At the 5th century, in the Council of Chalcedon, the Church confessed her faith that Christ is truly man and truly God. Now, the affirmations of historic Christianity about the Trinity, the deity of Christ, the atonement of Christ, those are affirmations that are shared by all Orthodox Christian bodies historically. Those affirmations are found historically in all of the creeds of the various denominations, so that the Lutherans and the Methodists and the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians historically have a large body of doctrine that they hold in common with each other. And that common essence of Christian thought is the foundation upon which all theology rests. So when we talk about Reformed theology as a distinctive, for example, to differentiate it from say, dispensational theology or Lutheran theology or whatever other particular theology we're talking about, we acknowledge at the outset that there is a common core of doctrine that is part of all of these different groups. Now, the reason I say that is there's a tendency to think about Reformed theology as if Reformed theology were simply the distinctives of Reformed theology. Some people say to me, well, tell me about Reformed theology. Isn't that the 5 points of Calvinism? And I will say, well, yes, the 5 points of Calvinism have much to say and much to do with the Reformed faith. And we'll get to an exposition of those concepts in this series. But it would be a very serious distortion of Reformed theology to think of it exclusively in terms of our distinctives. We must remember that those doctrines rest upon a common foundation that we share with a host of other Christian bodies. That is, we have a Catholic faith. Now, in addition to that, all Reformed theology is evangelical. Now that's the second broad heading we're using. The first was Catholic, the second is evangelical. Now, all who are evangelical in the historic sense are also Catholic. Not all who are Catholic are evangelical, but all who are evangelical share the common doctrine of the Church Universal with everybody else. Now, not everybody who is evangelical is Presbyterian or Lutheran or Methodist or any of these other distinctives, so that not everyone who is evangelical is Reformed. But everyone who is Reformed in the historic sense of the term also is evangelical. We share not only a common heritage of Catholic Christianity, but with our Protestant brothers and sisters, we share a common evangelical tradition. Now, again, the term evangelical is under siege in our day, and it's a question of confusion as to what it really refers to in our time. That confusion does not exist historically. At the time of the Reformation is when the term or label evangelical was coined, and it was coined by the Reformers because they believed that with the doctrine of justification by faith alone, they were recovering the evangel, or the gospel of the New Testament. And since the heart of the controversy of the 16th century focused on the doctrine of justification, the whole debate centered on the question, what is the gospel? So Protestants called themselves evangelicals, meaning by that label that they were embracing Luther's definition of the doctrine of justification, justification by faith. Now, out of that tradition, as we know, there were many people in the 16th century who embraced Luther's view of justification as the biblical view, and certain different traditions came from that, all of whom shared the central core conviction that justification is by faith alone, and that that's at the very heart of the gospel itself. But they went in other directions where they differed over questions of the sacrament, over church government, and over other doctrines, for example. But they kept this common commitment to that. The other doctrine that was common to historic evangelicalism was the doctrine of the authority of Scripture, or what is called sola scriptura, which we'll take up later on. And so historians have said that the material issue or cause of the Reformation was the doctrine of justification. The formal cause was the doctrine of the authority of Scripture. And that though, again, the Reformation saw a fragmentation of numerous bodies of Protestants, there was a core unity among them of agreement on two central theses. One, the doctrine of justification by faith alone, and two, the doctrine of the authority of Scripture. So, now we go to the third label, which is the label Reformed. Now, when we use that label, we are making further distinctions in the taxonomy of theology. A taxonomy is the science of classification. We do that in the biological world. We divide the kingdoms, the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom. All plants are in the animal kingdom, and all a plant kingdom, and all animals are in the animal kingdom. And then you get into those different kingdoms and you divide them, people between the phyla and the genus and the species and the order and all of those different things as you begin to refine more and more between mammals and reptiles and vertebrates and invertebrates and all of that sort of thing. You just keep making finer and finer and finer distinctions as we seek to understand the world around us. Well, we do the same thing in theology and in theological traditions. Now, there are many evangelical bodies, as I've said, Lutheran, Episcopalian, Methodist, Baptist, and so on, and they differ from each other at certain points. And when we talk about a Lutheran, we would say that a Lutheran is a person who holds to the historic doctrines that are particularly characteristic of Lutheranism. They also are evangelical, and they also are Catholic. Now, as the Reformed tradition is defined, we have doctrines that are specific to the Reformed faith that are not always shared by other Christian bodies. And so when we say that somebody is Reformed, we're saying all at the same time that that person embraces this distinctively Reformed creeds of history, such as the Heidelberg Catechism, the Belgic Confession, the Westminster Confession of Faith, and so on. In addition, they share a common evangelical heritage with other believers, and the whole thing is based upon the Catholic foundation. So just by way of preparation, we have to be careful not to think that this and this alone is the Reformed faith. Because the Reformed faith, though it has its own distinctives, contains within itself unifying doctrines with other Christians, with all evangelicals, and with those who hold the Catholic truths of historic Christianity. Now, what we will be doing in the rest of this series is paying close attention to those distinctives that mark off Reformed theology from other evangelical theologies and from the broad heading of Catholic theology. So from now on, we'll be examining the distinctives, but only with this caveat now, and this warning, I'm going to hold you to it, that you remember that when we look at the distinctives are not all that's there. The distinctives set on the platform, they're established on the foundation of Catholic and evangelical Christianity.